Hey there, Internet. Michael Besog here. It's May 18th, 2017, and I finally had someone unfriend me for making them feel dumb. There have been a few things of major import in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, like France giving up on being France and Antifa changing their tactics so they stop getting beaten down, and we'll talk about those coming up, so stay right there. So last week, France had an election that turned out the way CNN thought the American election would turn out. Marine Le Pen, the populist, was defeated in the polls by Emmanuel Macron. There's a lot of hope that Le Pen would continue this trend of national self-interest started with Brexit and the election of President Trump. Alas, France is more accustomed to surrender, so surrender they did. Macron was the candidate that said that terrorism will be a fact of daily life in the coming years. Now, many of us were hopeful that France would choose the rational path over the falsely virtuous self-sacrificial path. You see, electing Macron will ensure that France remains on the path of cultural relativism, open immigration, welfare state politics, that will ensure France is no longer really France in a few years. As for Antifa, there was a free speech rally and a march in Boston last Saturday, which didn't result in a riot, did not, and the newly armed fascists didn't get, punched in the face. There was, of course, some harassment, some flag burning, some Antifa whiny people getting in journalists' faces, all of which Christina Layla reported for the Gateway Pundit, and you can see the link below. But for the most part, it seems that this little movement may have found its plateau. They figured out that here in the United States, free speech is a sacred right, one that we'll fight to defend, and when we fight, they get their ass beat. This brings me to a recent Facebook discussion. I'm going to post the screenshots of this without redacting, because the person I was arguing against was very civil and deserves credit for his statements. It all started with this post from my friend. The question of using federal force to take over sanctuary cities indicates to me that the original poster doesn't understand federal power or what being a sanctuary city means. So let me make sure that we're on the same page here. First, each level of government, from city to county to state to federal, can create law. Only that level of government is responsible to enforce that law. Immigration and naturalization laws are federal laws and can only be federal laws. So only the federal executive has a legal obligation to enforce them. Keep in mind, though, that the federal government spends federal money, federal tax dollars, on cities and counties and states, and that's important because a sanctuary city is one in which local law enforcement will not assist federal law enforcement with regard to violators of immigration and naturalization law. That's all. They will not assist. They have every right to abstain. So this post asking if Trump should send troops to enforce federal law doesn't even make sense. The cities aren't breaking federal law, which is why I responded with no. That is not how the federal government is supposed to work. Just defund their entire state. Just as the states, counties, and cities have every right to abstain from assisting with federal law enforcement, the federal government has every right to abstain from assisting those states. This is where my conversation with A.J. Gilligan happened. I'm not going to repeat that entire argument or that entire conversation here because much of it centered on whether or not the state of California could secede, and that's the subject for an entirely separate video. But here's where the conversation turned toward free speech and Antifa. Based on some things that he stated, I felt the need to clarify some of my statements. In that clarification, I made the statement that the only fascists around today are calling themselves anti-fascists. To this he responded with this. He said, "That's laughable." He then said that he saw Trump supporters spit on people, which has nothing to do with fascists or Antifa. To this, I made the following statement. I said, it's cute that you think Antifa aren't fascists. What part of, and this is in quotes, forcible suppression of opposition and control of industry and commerce is Antifa not trying to do? I'm going to take a few guesses here. This is still in the post itself. You think hate speech exists. You think the U.S. Constitution is outdated. You think the government exists to do for people what they can't do for themselves. I said some other things, and I followed up with, I only engaged this conversation because at first you seemed rational. And you did, very much so. To which he smugly replied, I'd like to hear more on your argument that hate speech does not exist. Just that. Sell me on this. So, I posted the First Amendment. He replied that I must not understand what the First Amendment protects or the differences between free speech and the consequences of free speech. Now, this is the argument that Antifa is built upon. Keep that in mind. He's implying that the First Amendment doesn't protect speech that someone interprets as harmful. He's talking about the consequences of speech. Remember the video on microaggressions that I did a little while back? On being offended, right? That's the kind of harm Antifa is talking about. They will couch their arguments in more vitriolic terms, but nonetheless, they simply hyperbolize their opponent's position as much as is necessary in order to justify their actions. AJ claims that the actual fascists are calling for violence against minorities and POC, persons of color. To this I responded, no. The actual fascists are committing violence against people that disagree with them in order to silence them. You can see Antifa doing this at every event. I said, really, people are stating their opinions, their observations, etc. And whiny, entitled little Antifa wannabe communists don't have any valid way to counter their arguments. So, they threaten them with violence and commit violence in order to stop them from stating those opinions or those observations. Now, I want you to understand that I really have difficulty understanding or empathizing with people that dress like the Foot Clan or Cobra, but this is where I really discovered just how deeply the adherents of this idea believe their rhetoric. AJ's response to my assessment of the fascist tactics of Antifa was a series of this or that straw men that I'm convinced he truly believes are representative of reality. I'm almost certain he doesn't think he's exaggerating here. So I will read a lot of it in its entirety. Example 1, gay rights. AJ says, one conservative thinks that allowing gay marriage somehow affects his marriage. And keep in mind, that's a straw man. Thus, the state shouldn't recognize or give tax breaks to gay couples because he's so triggered at someone else's marriage that somehow his is affected. Antifa's response would be, you're a dick and a bigoted dumbass. Not agreeing with, but not violent. Let's stop right there. First of all, do we all recognize the straw man when one's fluffed up in front of us? I'm just checking. Second, there are two valid positions on marriage which classical liberals or libertarians or conservatives could take. One is that marriage is not a government function, which means no one gets tax breaks. And then the other would be that the government has an inherent interest in encouraging marriage between couples that have the ability to produce independently offspring, the next generation. And by independently, I mean like within just that one and another person couple. And so for that, tax breaks would be for heterosexual couples. Since I don't believe in wealth redistribution, I would prefer the former. But back to AJ. The Antifa's, if Antifa's response is that you're a dick, then that's fine. So on to example 2, he says, conservative number 2 says that gays are an affront to God, and it should be mandatory that all gays are rounded up and sent to gay conversion camps against their will. AJ says in the second example that Antifa starts to get ready to physically confront or block this guy. He says, we're going to counter-rally and physically obstruct him because what he says is suggesting in itself violence. So let's break this down. A person makes an ideological statement, in quotes, gays are an affront to God. And then also makes a proposed plan of illegal action, the should be rounded up and sent to conversion camps part. Let's apply the Brandenburg test, which is what the Supreme Court would apply to this to see if it should be protected speech or not. For the speech to be unprotected inflammatory speech, it has to satisfy the following conditions. The advocacy has to be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. And the advocacy is also likely to incite such action. We see that it satisfies the first, obviously, but this is 2017, and this is the United States, not the Middle East. If you believe that such speech is likely to incite violence, you have issues with reality. So let's look at his next example. AJ says that conservative number 1, I'm going to paraphrase this one, trans people need to use the bathroom they were assigned at birth. Antifa responds, you've been sharing bathrooms with trans people your entire lives. Now, I'm not going to say much here, but it's kind of laughable to think that most trans people are passable. And that's something that you'd have to assume in order for the statement to be true. So let's continue. AJ says, conservative number 2, trans people are all child molesters, and I will personally beat the shit out of any trans person trying to use my little girl's restroom. Trans people need to be all sent to insane asylums or jail. Antifa's response, AJ says, is this guy's getting punched because he's about to get someone murdered or killed for simply being trans. Now, I assume you, the viewer, probably at least in parts agree with this statement that dude's a dick, needs to get punched, something like that. Whatever. But that's not the point here. The point is that he's justifying Antifa's violence at places like Berkeley and Portland and Austin and DC and New York, Boston, by comparing speakers like Lauren Southern and Milo Yiannopoulos, a gay Jew, and Ann Coulter, like a 105-pound white lady, with these strawmen that he's creating here. Watch the videos of their talks yourself. See if they incite violence. Of course not. Instead, the same arguments made by anyone claiming to be microaggressed are being used here by Antifa against anyone who disagrees with them. They say, I claim that your statements are violence or that they are inciting violence, therefore they must be. This is ridiculous. There is some good news, though. Tennessee banned both terrorist groups, Black Lives Matter and Antifa, by passing the Campus Free Speech Protection Act. Look it up. If one state can do it, all of them can. Eventually, places like California, which will likely go the other way on these issues, will begin to look more like East Germany in the 70s and 80s, in that people will become too afraid to speak out and will eventually flee to better places, like many of the job-producing businesses already have. So what do you think? Are Antifa fighting windmills for their own glory, or are they preventing the violent overthrow of society by people that just want to speak freely on campuses? Let me know in the comments. As for the friend that unfriended me on Facebook because I made them feel dumb, here are some of the screenshots from that conversation. How did it happen? He broke the one rule of argument. He didn't watch my second video, which would have prevented him from calling names, from losing his cool, from becoming emotionally invested in a terrible argument. This is the same friend that is the subject of part of the video, Racist, Bigots, and Fascists, so you go ahead and watch that one as well, and you'll have a little more context as to why he finally gave up on trying to argue his points with me. As always, If you like this video, slam that like button below. If this is your first experience with my videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you'll know when I make the next one. I want to give a shout out to AJ Gilligan for holding a civil conversation with me. I do appreciate it very much. If we could do this more often, I think most of this problem would go away. As always, share this video with your friends or the terrorists win. Be safe, and I'll see you soon.